We're doing Sukkah Daf Gimmel, and we're going to discuss Helena, Amalka, the Queen Helena, and the statement of Reb Shmuel bar Reb Yitzchak that the law is that a sukkah requires the majority of the head and the person and the table, which is a very small amount, but that's going to establish the law to be like Beit Shammai. And then the third thing we're going to discuss is a very important Tosfot, Divrei HaMaschil, the Amr L'Chamani, Beit Shammai V'lo Sazus Minei. This Tosfot discusses many foundational things. We're going to mention the teachings of Reb Amram, who rules in 6 places like Beit Shammai over Beit Hillel. And one of the places that we're going to be specially emphasizing is the time where somebody eats a meal and does not make the Birkat HaMazon in that place. And then we're going to come to a debate and discussion between the Tosfos and the Rambam that does not agree with the Tosfos and the other Rishonim. Okay, and why does the Rambam not agree with them? Number 4, we're going to talk about the idea that sometimes the rabbis have the power to override the Torah, and particularly as mentioned in that very same Tosfos. That was number 4. Number 5 is going to be the debate between the Rif and the Tosfos and the Rambam about one of the laws of Beit Shammai. If somebody's sitting in a sukkah, big sukkah, but their table is outside of the sukkah, whether they fulfill their obligation or not. And then we'll also talk a little bit about the differences between a room that would require a mezuzah versus the room that would be the adequate size for the sukkah. They're not the same thing. And then we'll conclude with a discussion of Micah, of the gate that one is expected to put around the rooftop. Okay, so let's start with number 1, which is Queen Helena. Who exactly is Queen Helena? How does she come in to our Gemara? So the Wikipedia entry for Helena of Adiabin is that her name is Helene in Hebrew. She was the queen mother of a Parthian vassal state of Adiabin. Her husband and brother, Monobaz, or Munbaz, as we like to call him in the Talmud, 1. She was the mother of Izatz, 2, and Munbaz, 2. Helena became a convert to Judaism about the year 30 CE. According to Josephus, Helena was the daughter of King Azatzes. Moses of Harin makes her the chief wife of Abgar, the king of Edessa. Now, how does she come into our story in the Talmud? She spent time in Jerusalem. In fact, she's credited with putting a golden door exterior to one of the doors in the temple that had like a menorah engraved on it. And when the sun would rise, everybody could see the reflection from those candles for the reading of the Shema. And there's many other things archaeologically that point to her presence in Jerusalem, including a palace and a burial place. So this is one of the kind of historical figures that plays an important role in that time period. And the rabbis in our daf, on Daf Gimmel, are having a conversation that a sukkah that's higher than 20 amot is debated whether it's kosher or not. The rabbis say it is not kosher, and Rabbi Yehuda says it is kosher. And Rabbi Yehuda says, I'll tell you how I know it's kosher. In an earlier time, when Queen Helena was in Jerusalem, she had a majestic, very tall sukkah. It was definitely higher than 20 amot. And the rabbis would visit her in the sukkah. Nobody said a word to her. We also know she had children, the Talmud comments. She supposedly had 7 children, according to the Talmud. So definitely some of those children, if they were not outright bar mitzvah, they would definitely reach the age of needing to be having training, what we call chinuch. And therefore, that to Rabbi Yehuda is proof that the rabbis of the yesteryear had no problem with sukkah higher than 20 amot. Now the rabbis disagree and say, well, she was a woman, so they didn't say anything to her. And it's a question really of who exactly was in the sukkah with her. Was she in an individual sukkah? And that gets back to, why do the rabbis say a sukkah that's higher than 20 amot is not kosher? Is it because you can't see the schach? Is it because you're not sitting in the shade of the sukkah because it's so tall? Or is it because it can't be so permanent? So those are the 3 reasons. And then there's a 4th reason that the Gemara says that doesn't fit into necessarily any of those 3. And it's in that context that the Gemara is trying to have an understanding of this story of Hilni Amalka, or Helena. Now, the Gemara has some semi-far-fetched answers. So they speak that there are little rooms, there are big rooms and little rooms, and then that starts to really trouble Rashi in trying to reconcile one of the opinions of those 4 opinions that says that the only time a sukkah that's so tall isn't kosher is if it's not more than 7 by 7 tefachim, which is very problematic to fit into this story of Helena. Rashi says that pretty much doesn't really work within the story, and Tosfot answers that we could reconfigure it a certain way. And that's interesting because the rabbi's interest in historical figures is principally either ethical teachings or halachic teachings. In this case, it was a halachic extraction that we're trying to deduce, and this give and take in this Gemara, it remains inconclusive at the end, and that's why, even though everyone tries to prove something from the story, everyone has a different spin on it and understands what exactly happened or what the situation was differently, and therefore, like many other times where we talk about something that happened in history, we're not sufficiently aware of the details to really extract a valid proof for either Rabbi Yehuda or one of the other opinions within the rabbis. Okay, but at least it's interesting to know. That's the first thing. The second thing we're talking about now is a statement of Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak. And who is Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak? He was a leader in Israel. I believe he was Babylonian, but then he moved to Israel, if I'm not mistaken. And he was an Amora. And therefore, his rulings were taken quite seriously, especially since he was about to make a ruling in favor of Beit Shammai over Beit Hillel. Why is that such a major issue? Because in most situations, with very rare exceptions, we actually say that Beit Shammai b'makom Beit Hillel eno mishnah, which means that when the house of Shammai argues with the house of Hillel, we really don't even consider the school of Shammai. So therefore, to say that in this particular case the law is like Hillel, that's a major thing. Now, what is that law exactly that we're talking about? That he says, halacha is shricha shetei v'achsekes rosho berubo v'shulchanam. The law is that the sukkah has to be able to contain a person's head, the majority of their person, and their table. Now, in fact, it's a very small table, and it's a very small majority of the person's body. So that's the Gemara will explain. Rabbi Abba Kiman. Rabbi Abba asks, who exactly are we following here? Beit Shammai? Could it be that you actually are saying we should follow the house of Shammai? Amar Le, Shmuel Bar Yitzchak responded, and for some reason, I believe Rabbi Hananel says it was Rav Huna that responded, but we'll go with the simple reading that Shmuel Bar Yitzchak responded, that Allah Kaman, who else would it be like? In other words, it was somewhat facetious, like, yes, yeah, that's who it goes like. Ikadami, or others record the conversation as follows. Amar Abba, Amar Lachmani, Rab Abba said, who is that like? Amar Le Beit Shammai, Ivelos Houses Minei. The response was, that is the opinion of the house of Shammai, and don't budge from it. Now, is one serious Amora enough to make the law like Beit Shammai? And the answer is obviously, if nobody else is really arguing with that Amora, yes, absolutely. And therefore, Shmuel Bar Yitzchak, even though he's asked like incredulously, could that be like Shammai? The answer, when he answers yes, it is, or in the second way where he says very much so, don't budge from it. When there's no pushback, maybe some initial like skepticism, but after it's not met with any argument beyond that, we do follow even the house of Shammai. So that's very interesting to know. Now we're going to get to teaching number 3, which is the amazing Tosfos, Amar L'Chamani Beit Shammai Hivelos Houses Minei. Now, in this Tosfos, the Tosfos quotes from Amram that rules in 6 places like Beit Shammai over Beit Hillel. And one of them is here. And the others are talking about the laws of tzitzis that are brought down on the 40th daf of Menachot. And the other one, the one that I'm interested in sharing with you fascinating details with, is a Gemara on the 52nd page. I'm sorry, 51b. Maybe it spills over in 52a. In Brachot, actually, that's not the one I'm interested in, but that's related somehow. There is a particular law in a Mishnah that we say, even though there's a series of arguments between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, but that particular law that says you first sweep up the house and then you wash your hands. This is talking about the Seder of what you do when you're eating and benching. We say that the law is like Beit Shammai, even though the rest of the chapter, the law is like Beit Hillel. Now, there's only one problem. In that same chapter, it describes in Brachot, somebody who eats and forgets, doesn't make the Birchat HaMazon in the place that they ate. There's a couple, and Beit Hillel says that's okay, whenever they remember, they can make the Birchat HaMazon wherever they are. But Beit Shammai argues, this is no, they have to go back to where they initially ate. Now, Beit Shammai gives his argument, and he says, look, if you would have found, if you'd have lost your wallet, you'd go back. So why wouldn't you go back for this? But the bottom line is, as good as that argument may or may not be, because there's a counter argument offered in the Yerushalmi, the Gemara tells a series of stories, miraculous stories. One is with the great sage Rabba Bar Chana, who often has miracles occurring to him. He was traveling with a caravan, and as you know, travel in those days wasn't very safe, so you had strength in numbers. And he ate a meal. They had stopped in the rest area. But when they said time to go, in his haste to get back on track with everyone else, he just forgot to bench. And they had just gone a little whiles away, maybe not miles and miles, but they were no longer there. And he remembered, and he decided that he wants to go back to bench. He didn't know how to tell them. If he would tell them, I want to go back and do Birchot Hamazon, they would laugh at him. So instead, he told a white lie. He said, I forgot a golden dove in the rest area. Is it okay for me to go back to get it? I said, sure, we'll wait for you here. It's not that long. Go and come back and we'll just wait for you. So he goes and he benches, and miracle of miracles, he finds a golden dove, comes back, he's happy to show them he found it. Here, I got my golden dove. But first of all, let's stop for a moment and ask, how can you make a fib, a lie, about something? First of all, why can't he rely on Beit Hillel? We usually rule like Beit Hillel. That's one question. Second of all, we say onus rachmana patre. If you were under duress, the Torah forgives you. So he doesn't really have a way to go back. Imagine you're on a cruise ship and you set sail. You're going to say, oh, but I at my last stop, I didn't bench. Can you go back? They're going to laugh at you. They don't go back for like medical emergencies. Usually, they're not going to go back for you to bench. So, what exactly is going on, and why specifically did he mention that he had left behind a golden dove? And the answer is found on the Ben Yehoyada on Brachos. It says the following thing: when you bless God, specifically after you've benefited from something in this world, you cause the divine presence, the Shekhinah, to hover above you, like the way a bird hovering above its nest. So what he was saying is, if I'm allowed to go back to where I was and perform a mitzvah, then God's presence, which is like a golden dove, will hover over me, and I will have gotten back a golden dove. So the question then is, that's very nice, but that's a metaphor. And the answer is that when somebody is really holy, the metaphor and the actuality begin to merge, and they create a new reality out of their holiness. So that's what happens. So he goes back, and perhaps for him on the level that he's at, he's seeing reality on this higher level. It's like a concrete golden bird for him to have the mitzvah in its proper place, because there's a relationship between where you got your satisfaction from your eating and the blessing you're giving in return to God. Not just God. God is everywhere, but you ate in that place. So then the question becomes like, so does that mean the ruling is like Shammai, Beit Shammai? What about Hillel? I mean, not only do we ordinarily rule like Hillel, even that particular chapter acknowledges that there's only one exception to the rules following Hillel, and it's not that, it's something else. So it really still begs the question of why would you follow the house of Shammai, unless the answer is that Maisa Rav, you learn by a story. Here was a great rabbi. He jeopardized his own standing in his own caravan to lie. Turns out it wasn't really a lie, because he came back with the golden dove. We must say that there's something to it. Perhaps we follow Shammai either because we rule like Shammai, or it's a mili de chasidusa. It's a extraordinary act that became expected of one to do because of the self-sacrifice that Rabbi Baruch Chana had. Usually, I would argue that what Rabbi Baruch Chana does is not something we need to learn from, because it's extraordinary and miraculous. But perhaps a second story is needed, which the Gemara also has, another story there, which is, it says that there was two students. One student followed the ruling of Shammai and went back to go to where he had forgotten to bench, and he was rewarded and found some, like somebody's money belt over there, and became, I don't know, wealthy, but got something of value because he followed the house of Shammai, as opposed to somebody else who didn't follow Shammai at all, maybe didn't even follow Hillel, because he purposely left not benching, knowing that he should have benched in the place that he was, and went away, and then eventually at some point he got eaten by a lion. Now that's a little bit of a harsh punishment to not bench in the place that you ate. Perhaps what it refers to is the concept is that we're always in danger, especially if you're outside in nature. There's mountain lions, there's coyotes, there's rattlesnakes if you're in Arizona. So it's not that God punishes that person, but he didn't have the extra protection he needed to get home safely, so to speak. Because all traveling in danger is a state of danger. So the bottom line is we've got three stories that back up, follow the house of Shammai. And therefore, Tosfot says, guess what? I'm going to follow the house of Shammai. How do you reconcile that with this, that we follow Hillel? Well, maybe even Hillel would say, you know what? Beit Shammai in this case is a chumrah. It's not a bad thing to do. So go ahead. Maybe Beit Hillel will give you permission for some reason. We don't on a technicality, we don't rule like Beit Shammai, but in reality, we do follow it. That's Tosfos. And Reb Amram says, quoted by Tosfos, that you do follow him. It is one of the 6 exceptions that you follow the house of Shammai over the house of Hillel. Now, interestingly enough, the Rosh agrees with Reb Amram. The Rosh is the head of the Ashkenazi poskim of the Rishonim, and not the head, but one of the major heads. The Rambam says, no, we do not follow the house of Shammai, and if you forget to bench and leave, you bench wherever you are when you remember, like Beit Hillel. What about all of these proofs, these 3 stories that we told that seem to indicate that in reality you should do like Beit Shammai says? Now, it could be the following. So the Rambam is very aware that the law follows Hillel all the time, unless there's a reason to. And specifically in that chapter in Bachot, the Gemara already had stated that there's no exceptions to the house of Shammai being followed in this chapter, other than the thing with sweeping, and therefore that would exclude the benching debate as being an exception to the rule of following Hillel. Now, what about those 3 stories? What do you do with those 3 stories? So that's the Rambam L'Shita. So the Rambam says that Torah lo b'shamayim hi. And the Rambam doesn't say this, the Gemara says this. But the Rambam would echo the sentiment that Torah isn't in heaven. We don't use miracle stories to establish what the law is. We follow principles, and the principle here follows Hillel, and therefore it could be that Rabbi Bar Chana wanted to be stricter, but we don't establish the law like that. It could be that other rabbi wanted to be stricter, but we don't establish the law like that. That's their own personal chassidut, and God may have rewarded them, but that doesn't get recorded as the halacha. And that's consistent with the Rambam, who's downgrading the role of miracles and definitely doesn't want miracles in the decision-making of halacha to be a determining factor. That already has antecedents in the Gemara, where we say that ein mashkichin bebaskol. According to Rabbi Yoshua, we don't pay any attention to a baskol. That even, according to his opinion, even though there was a baskol that says the halacha is like Hillel in every place, we don't follow, according to Rabbi Yeshua, the heavenly voice as much as the Torah's guidelines of, we follow the majority. Achrei Rabbim Lahatas. We follow the majority of the sages who agreed with Beit Hillel, therefore the halacha is like Beit Hillel. So that could be a consistent theme that carries over from the time of the Tanaim already. Not everyone was in agreement with that. There were other people who said you do pay some attention to Baskal in limited parameters, and the Gemara and Brachos and the Tosfos and Brachos discuss that. There's another factor here that some of the Rishonim who rule like Beit Shammai may be taking into the equation that the Gemara challenges the followers of Hillel by saying, well, if you forgot your wallet, wouldn't you go back to it? And Hillel's followers don't respond. So usually when some rabbis don't respond, that might be an indication they don't have a counter argument. That might be why the Rambam, who was well-versed in the Yerushalmi, and knew that the Yerushalmi has an extended version of that back and forth, and in that version, the house of Hillel answers the house of Shammai and says, well, what if somebody went down a ditch, or was working in a well, like a maintenance worker, in a very dangerous, precarious situation. And they were there for hours, and they took their lunch, and they ate their lunch, and then they took them out of this well, and now, an hour later, they're like, oh, I ate my lunch there. What do I have to go? I have to go, climb down a well? You don't. So it could be, and this is brought down in the Divrei Yirmiyahu, that because the Rambam knew this Yerushalmi, he didn't consider the Bavli's version of the challenge being unanswered to be indicative of the law being like Shammai, and therefore that's one of the reasons why he would continue to follow Hillel as well. Okay, so that's number 3. Number 4 is the idea of asa kedivri Beit Shammai lo asa below klum, which is if you do like Shammai, it's like you did nothing. Tosfot in that same Divrei HaMaschal D'Amar L'Chamani Beit Shammai below Sasus Minei says the following thing: that when you do against the halacha, you didn't do anything. Now, for example, just to quote Tosfot, "Afilo de oraisa," even if technically speaking, the nature of the debate is an extra stringency, according to Beit Hillel, to fulfill the mitzvah that Beit Shammai doesn't have. And you don't go the extra mile. You just do the oraisa minimum, the biblical minimum. According to Tosfot, it could be that the rabbis take away your kiyum mitzvah. They take away your doing the mitzvah, which is a crazy idea. I mean, if you did the mitzvah, even if you didn't do it according to the specific, like, additional teaching of Beit Hillel, but even Hillel would agree you did the minimal requirement. How could he take away even the minimal fulfillment of the mitzvah? And this is something that's debated and discussed amongst the Rishonim and the Achronim, exactly the extent of how is Tosfos talking about this particular situation in Sukkah, or is he talking about many other situations as well? I'd like to mention a number of areas that we would have to ask this question. One would be, or A, nusach of birchas hamazon, the terms that we use in the grace after meal. Or, in other words, we say that the rabbis, based on a takana of earlier people, including Moshe and Yoshua, they were misaken. They instituted specific type of words to be used. So it's a matbeya. It has a certain liturgical composition. What if somebody changes in that composition? Do they at least fulfill the biblical? If they had the bare minimum of the biblical concept in the Birchas Hamazon, do they still fulfill that at least? Or do we say, since they changed the nusach significantly, they will not even fulfill their basic obligation? So that's A. B is nusach hatfilah. Now you could say nusach hatfilah, that's a ridiculous addendum to this question, because everybody knows tefillah is only rabbinic, and it is only rabbinic. Even the Rambam that says that there's a biblical mitzvah to Adam every day doesn't consider the matbeya shel tefillah, the liturgical composition of tefillah, to be biblical per se. But I'm going to argue with that and say that there's certain elements of tefillah that have a kiyum de oraisa, that have a fulfillment of a biblical mitzvah. It could be of avat Hashem, yirat Hashem, amanot elokut, dveikut, particular aspects of yichud Hashem, and of course, some of the things that we're required to remember, whether it's Yetziat Mitzrayim or it's Tzitzis or there, I don't know, Miriam, Shabbos. So when you change, or on special days like Rosh Hashanah, Malchiyot, Zechronot, and Shofar, again, it's not that they're necessarily requirements min Torah, but they're hitting certain key elements that could be fulfilling a kiyum d'oraisa, like we enumerated. When you change the matbeya of those brachot, when people like tamper with liturgical wording, is the tefillah, is the kiyum of those things still taking place if you got the bare minimum? Or do we say that once you tamper with some of those things, you're not getting a kiyum of those things? Or even the kiyum of the rabbinic mitzvah of davening, are you not getting it? So that's, again, I'm not here to answer the question as much as ask the question. A third thing would be, that's the second thing. The third thing would be a nusach of brachot. When you're making a bracha, let's say berkas hanenin, a bracha on food. A fourth thing would be kiddush. The rabbis were koveya how you make kiddush on wine. Fifth, what if you make kiddush without the wine? The fifth thing would be when you daven. According to the rabbis, you have to say Kriya Shema at night by midnight. What if you said it afterwards? Are you not yotze at all? A sixth thing would be the sukkah that we're talking about here. Whether if it wasn't the right shiur or if it was the right shiur, but the table was outside of the sukkah, and then so on and so forth. The lulav that you shook on Shabbos, Shechalios, on the holiday of Sukkot fell out on the first day, or the latter day fell out on Shabbos, and you shook it anyway. You blew the shofar on Shabbos. What did you do? You didn't follow the rabbinic instruction not to. What if you didn't mention Pesach Matzah and Mar on the Seder? What about all the cases where you do a Kedushin not according to the way the rabbis say you should do the Kedushin? Sometimes we say Afkina Rabban le Kedushin Mineh. The rabbis take away the Kedushin. Other times we don't say it. What about by a get? And of course, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. So one way of understanding all of these things is, for example, the rabbis have limited capacity of making a decree. And beyond that, the decree doesn't necessarily affect the kiyum of the mitzvah. It could affect the level of the kiyum of the mitzvah. That's one way of seeing things. Another way, so they could, for example, make a chalosa isser. They could create an isser to carry a shofar on Rosh Hashanah Shcholiyot b'Shabbos. But what about the actual hearing of the sound? Would you make a shechianu the second day if you already heard it the first day, even though it was Shabbos? These are questions. Then we have the Ishbitzer, who says everything in the Torah has a built-in mechanism so that we can safeguard and protect it. And the rabbis are given the job to carry on this very important mission. And he gives an example. He says, if you look in the Torah, why do we find that there's certain mitzvot that you can take on for yourself that are not for Klal Yisrael? He gives an example of a neder. Person makes a vow, or a person makes themselves into a nazir. They now have prohibited themselves of certain things that are permitted to everyone else. And they have to bring karbanot because of it, and so on. And he says this because that individual person, for example, may be an alcoholic, and he needs to take himself out of the equation from even coming close to a sip of wine. So he creates a sanctity. The Torah gives him permission to create a sanctity that doesn't exist for normal people. But there's a great danger in that. And that's why there are mechanisms to even undo the vow. There's Hataras Nedarim and Hafaras Nedarim based on the circumstance. And that's why we have Sugyas and Masechtas and Gemara and Halacha that deal with these things. But just like you have that for individual, you also have that for a time. That's why the rabbis, when they make a decree, they're making a decree to safeguard a Torah law. They're not making it for all time. They're making it for all the time until a greater based in numbers and wisdom comes, and then they can undo the decree of an earlier based in. Why? Because it was there as a protective element to ensure that the Ikar, the main thing, the Torah law itself, wouldn't become washed away by the times, by the challenges we have today. That's why it's so important to have rabbinic figures. And the rabbis weren't shy about exerting their influence because they understood that without it, you would not have a Torah at all. But that's the Ishbitzer. We'd have to fit him in, and that's part of the Torah that I like to teach, is fitting in the answer to all these questions, each one in its appropriate place. So hopefully I've had many shiurim that touch on different aspects of these things, and maybe one day we'll try to put them together. So that was number 4, and number 5 is the debate between the Rif and the Rush, and Tosfos. But we'll do Tosfos, the Rif, and the Rambam. And what's the debate? Where is the debate about? We rule like Beit Shammai with a small sukkah that needs to be 7 tefachim by 7 tefachim, not 6 by 6 like Beit Hillel, because the one extra tefach is considered for the shulchan, for the table. What about a big sukkah? We say there's a debate between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, not just by a little sukkah, but even by a big sukkah. If your table is outside of the big sukkah, Beit Shammai says no good, because you're going to be drawn after your table. You're going to eventually leave the table, the sukkah. And Beit Hillel says, no, it is good. It is good. Because we're not worried a person is going to leave the sukkah. Tosfos rules that the law is only like Beit Shammai in a small sukkah, but when it's a big sukkah, the law is like Beit Hillel. They're two independent debates, according to Tosfos. The Rif holds it's one and the same debate, and therefore the law is like Beit Shammai about both of them. And the Rambam holds, interestingly enough, that the law is like Shammai in both of them, but not on the same level. But the small sukkah, if you don't have at least 7 by 7, the sukkah is totally disqualified. On a big sukkah, that you have the table outside of the sukkah, we still follow Beit Shammai and require you to not be in that sukkah until you bring the table in. But it's not the same level of psul. It's not the same level of disqualification. In other words, we have to ask the question, what's the difference? Is the psul, the Rif says the thing is that the hagdara, the definition of a sukkah that's too small, is because it's permanently requiring you to leave the sukkah to go after your table. Because part of being in a sukkah is you need to be able to eat in the sukkah. So you need a tiny place to put your food down. On the other hand, Tosfos says, no, they're two separate things. One requires a sukkah needs to be a certain size to be a kosher sukkah. Without that size, it's just not a sukkah, or not a kosher sukkah at least. But in terms of fear of leaving the sukkah because of some external reason, like your table being somewhere else, that's a different debate, and we don't rule like Shammai in that. And the Rambam is very interesting, so that needs to be analyzed. And in the Rishima Shiurim, I don't have to repeat it, but you could look in the Rishima Shiurim of Rabbi Soloveitchik to see a nice analysis of that. Now the Gemara continues and says, that number 6, there's a difference between a room that requires a mezuzah, that it has to be at least 4 by 4 amot, as opposed to a kosher sukkah only needs to be 7 by 7 tefachim, much smaller. A sukkah is much smaller. Why? Because a room you need to be able to live in. A sukkah doesn't have that same requirement. And then the Gemara lists a number of things on Daf Gimmel Amud Beis as well, gets into the details of things that require Daled al Daled Amud, 4 by 4 Amud. One of them is, in order to be required to build a makkah, a fence, you need to have at least 4 by 4 Amud. If it's less than that, you don't have to build a fence. And the question is, Rabbi Soloveitchik asks a very simple question. There's two concepts of a makkah. There's a positive thing that when you build a house, make sure to make a gate around the roofs. But the second reason is lo sasim damin. The Gemara, the Torah explains why, because you don't want somebody to stumble, fall, and have blood on your hands because you didn't take the necessary precautions for safety. So it may be that it's not a house, so you don't have the aseh, the positive commandment. But what about the lo aseh? Of not causing blood to be spilled, that you would still have. And Rabbi Soloveitchik answers that, well, if it's not a house, then we're not worried about, it's not a rooftop either. It's something else, and we're not worried about people being up there. So, well, what if you are? Then I guess that's another question. There's a consistently we're learning this. The Daf Yomi is learning Baba Kama right now. You have to be concerned for things that could cause damage. It's something else. So if it's something that could cause damage, okay, so you deal with it. But in terms of the Micah, usually they're one and the same. The positive and the negative are interconnected. If it's not really a house, where there's not really a concern that people are going to be on top of it on a roof. That's not a roof because it's not a thing. So that's a little bit about the Sukkah versus Mezuzah and Micah. Thank you.